Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Courtney Dogger and I'm the president of Network 2020. It's a pleasure to have three remarkable panelists today and to welcome you all to our webinar on Afghanistan, why and what's next. Obviously, this is a monumental topic with a lot to delve into, and I hope that at Network 2020, over the next few months, there are different pieces of this story that we want to dig deeper into. This is really just a first pass. I think that there's a lot of soul searching that I think those in the US in particular are in need of doing. And then there's also the ongoing story of what's happening in Afghanistan and the region. And so we do want to cover all of that. I'm just letting you know that this is really our first take with so much having happened in the past couple of weeks. So with that, I'd just like to say a little bit about Network 2020. So we are an inclusive international community. We're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy worlds. We run foreign affairs briefings like this one online. We do closed sessions for our members with top foreign policy experts. We run research programs abroad. We're launching our first deep dive on China this fall. So we do a lot of different programs. Please do check out our website and follow us on social media. And with that, I will not do justice to the long bios of our panelists, but really just introduce them briefly and let you know why we wanted to invite them. So we have Ambassador Robert Finn, who has a very distinguished career in diplomacy in the Foreign Service, including as US Ambassador to Afghanistan in 2002, so way back in the early days. And so we thought his perspective from the State Department as a diplomat and having been in Afghanistan in the early days was incredibly valuable. He also has spent a lot of time in Turkey, which is also a part of this story as well, as we'll talk about later on. And next we have Ahmed Rashid, who is a journalist. He's from Pakistan. He is literally an author of a book on the Taliban, so is quite an expert and can give us a lot of insight. We invited him here because of that expertise, because of his understanding of the region, because of his the work that he's done both as a journalist and on the ground. So he really will add a tremendous amount to the conversation. And last but not least, we have retired Brigadier General Peter Zwack. We often bring Peter on to talk about Russia, but that is not his sole expertise. He was actually one of the senior intel officers in Afghanistan in 2008, 2009. So a very interesting period, which should provide a different contrast to when Ambassador Finn was there. So those are our three panelists. I am so grateful to all of them for joining. Just one quick word. We are juggling a lot of different time zones and locations. So if we have any trouble with internet, our panelists might have to turn off their camera, but hopefully all will go well. So we'll do about 20 to 30 minutes of moderated conversation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So I'm going to start, Ahmed, with you and with what I usually like to do, which is basically a scene setter question, because I always find it interesting where people think history starts. Often when we're talking about Afghanistan right now, there's a focus on this 20-year cycle. It's the 20th anniversary of September 11th. It's 20 years since the US went into Afghanistan, but often the story begins much earlier. And so could you just give us a little bit of context about where the Taliban came from and what the US involvement was like in Afghanistan prior to this 20-year marker that we've been talking about? Where does history, so to speak, begin in your mind?
Well, Courtney, the Taliban history begins right after the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989, which was followed by a brutal, bloody civil war for several years between the Afghan warlords and various factions. And the Taliban emerged in 92, 93 as a movement made up largely of religious students who'd been studying in Pakistan and in Afghanistan, and wanting to clean up the country and wanting to put an end to warlordism. And they initially succeeded very well. They became very popular, and they took Kabul in '96. And then they changed from becoming this sort of do-good, clean-up people to be having their own ambitions, wanting to rule Afghanistan. And that's when another civil war starts between the Taliban, who are largely from the south, and the northern minorities, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras. And that civil war continues basically until 9/11. And it was really brutal and lethal, and with several massacres of hundreds of people. And at that time, the leader of the Taliban was this very reclusive Mullah Omar, who stayed in Kandahar. He never came to the capital, Kabul. And in Kabul, you had a government of a kind with the religious leaders, but they were given ministerial posts, and it appeared to be a government. And it looks like that the Taliban are going to create the same system again in the next couple of days when they announce their leadership. They will have a spiritual leader in Kandahar who will be Maulvi Akhundzada, who is presently the head of the Taliban, and he will preside over the council or the shura of the Taliban. And then you will have a government of sorts in Kabul with the ministries handed out to various factions. The big question, of course, is that are the Taliban going to allow non-Taliban to become members of the government? Because that's what the foreigners and the international community is looking for, is some kind of plural system rather than a pure 100% Taliban government. They've already said that women will not be included in the cabinet, although they will come in lower down in the hierarchy. But the real question now in the next couple of days is to see whether they include non-Taliban or not.
Thank you. And one follow-up question, if I may. You mentioned how the Taliban sort of evolved from this group that had some popular support for a while, and then over time, when they had greater ambitions, that's when they kind of hit some roadblocks. There's been a lot of talk recently about, is the Taliban of 20 years later, is it the same Taliban or is it a different Taliban? Have they adapted to the Afghanistan that has changed in 20 years? And what's your take on that right now?
Well, I think really the essentials of the Taliban belief system has not changed at all. They are still, their interpretation of Sharia or Islamic law is extremely extreme and severe and harsh, and depends not so much on justice, which Sharia is supposed to be on, but more on punishment for wrongdoers. There's a very strong influence of the Pashtun tribal code, which is interpreted again in many different ways, but the Taliban have chosen to interpret it in the harshest possible way. And there's a dislike of foreigners. There's a real not just anti-American, but anti-foreign of all kinds, because foreigners are deemed to be non-Muslim and heathens as such. So this belief system has not changed from 20 years ago to today. What has changed, perhaps, is their exposure to the outside world, and the fact that they do recognize that if they want people now to run the government, the economy, to fix things and make sure the electricity runs and the rest of it, they're going to have to call upon technical people, educated people, who will not have the same belief system. And to them, they may be a bit more moderate. But so far, it's been a very mixed, what we've heard has been very mixed, because the Taliban have been chasing down some of the middle class experts, and many of them, of course, have fled in this airlift. And on the other hand, what they're saying is that we will allow women to go to school, education, etc., etc. But we really have to see how their performance is going to match what they're saying.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Finn, turning to you. You were the first US ambassador in Afghanistan after 2001, at a time when things were going relatively well. Did you foresee what was to come, based on your understanding of Afghanistan at the time? And in retrospect, is there anything that could or should have been done differently at the outset to avoid this outcome?
Well, I didn't foresee what is happening today, but I did foresee that we would be there for 20 years, even though everyone was saying we would be out in a year or two. I didn't see that was possible because I saw that the needs of Afghanistan were imperative and very difficult to achieve. And before I even went there, I said, what has to be done for Afghanistan to succeed? And I said it has to be able to feed itself, defend itself, and govern itself. And that has not really taken place, even though there have been great improvements in many, many different areas. But we're left with a situation that's almost identical to the situation in the fall of 2001, with a small resistance group up in the Panjshir Valley, the same people who were there at that point. So that's very sad. I didn't see this war going on. When I left in late 2003, I said, well, the Taliban are going to be around, they're going to be up in the mountains, they're going to be bandits and villains, and they'll be an annoyance to everyone. But I did not foresee that they're going to take over again. But I did see was that Afghanistan needed to have a functioning government in every area. And one thing that I tried to work for while I was there, which didn't occur, was to set up a civil service so that you would have government cadres, young, educated people. And don't forget, for a whole generation, the people who had been running Afghanistan were people who were brought up in a Soviet command economy. So they had severe ideological problems that had to be dealt with. They had to be re-educated. And the warlords in the countryside. And by not training new cadres, young, educated people, and having them go out to govern the country, there was no alternative but for the local people to go back to the same warlords that they had all along, and that they still have today, because the replacement was never put in place. Now, with the money that was given to Afghanistan, the programs that were brought in, it might have been possible to do something. I'm not saying that it would, and they certainly did try things with the provincial reconstruction teams, but that came in under the aegis of the military, not under the aegis of the civilian government. So I think that was an area where things could have been done. When I was there at that time, and it did get better later, but when I was there, the ministries were readily identifiable ethnically by just looking at the people at the door. If you knew your ethnic groups in Afghanistan, you didn't have to ask which group the minister belonged to, because you could see by looking at the people standing in the doorway what they were. Later on, I understand it got more representative. But that was a problem. You know, these problems began in the beginning, and they were there before then as well. So that was one issue. The other issue, and Dr. Brahimi, who was the UN special rep at the time, has pointed this out already, that at the Bonn meeting that set this system up, everyone was saying everyone is here, but the Taliban weren't there. And how can you have an inclusive government if you don't have people who are running the country until just a few months before? It wouldn't have been easy, and it probably wouldn't have worked out. And the history of Afghanistan is a history of traduction and people betraying one another in internecine fights, on and on and on for centuries. So it certainly wouldn't have been easy, but it might have been a way of getting things more resolved. As Ahmed pointed out, the Taliban started out being good guys in the eyes of many Afghans, and that's still the case. Maybe not good guys, but better than the other guys. So I think, you know, instead of taking the very harsh attitude towards the Taliban that we did take, I think maybe a more nuanced approach could have done better things. And Hamid Karzai, for his part, always referred to the Taliban as the brothers, and he always had a hand open. He was talking to them. He was trying to do something. He had worked with them years before they sort of, turned in the wrong direction. So something was done, but it didn't happen in any formalistic way. And I think that might have made the situation a little bit more manageable. Because don't forget, as rigid as the Taliban are, there are lots of other rigid people in Afghanistan. They're very extreme, but there are lots of other extreme people too. They're not that far away from what many people believe. So there was some room there to do something. And the third problem that arose was the Iraq War. Shortly after it looked like things were okay, then all of a sudden we were going to war in Iraq, a war which turned out to be a needless war. And the Afghans said, "Oh, they're leaving us. They're not here for the long term. So we have to look around and see what's going to be next down the road, because we have to save ourselves." All Afghans are always constantly jockeying for position for survival, because that's the nature of that society, that when you don't have a formalistic Western kind of government that grew up over centuries. Why did we have feudalism? We had feudalism because the feudal lords could protect people from the other people who were out to get them. Well, Afghanistan was still in that state. So when we started taking away the resources and started looking over in the direction of Iraq, Afghans started looking around. So those are the things that I noticed at that time. And then a fourth thing, and this is a problem that we always have with the United States, we can only see as far as the next election. And we can't plan for a future. And when you're dealing with a country that was at the very bottom of world standards, you have to plan for long-term things, not for things. The military people, and I'm sure Peter will talk about this, they were always saying that we fought a new war every year for 20 years. We didn't fight a 20-year war. And so and then this is true in other planning as well. The money always came after it was needed. It was never sufficient for the need at that time. So this is not a problem just in Afghanistan, it's a problem across the board in the United States, both domestically and foreign. In Afghanistan, it was a very serious problem.
All right, thank you. So inability to create a civil service not involving the Taliban. Yes, yeah, all excellent points. And a lot of them, I think that come from that we in the US would need to address ourselves. Peter, turning to you, again, you were a senior intel officer in Afghanistan right when the US, this is sort of after we got distracted by Iraq and then started to look to Afghanistan again. What was your take on that counterinsurgency strategy that we employed around that time? And similarly to the question that I asked Ambassador Finn, are there things or were there things that we should have been doing differently at the time?
No, thank you, Courtney. Write books about this very quickly. First of all, understanding the nature of the land, the people, the terrain. We're in a landlocked nation in the heart of South Asia. Troops and great civilian NGOs are growing with issues in a hidebound society, patriarchal society that has tension between the cities and the rural area. We land in the middle of this. In 2001, we push out very quickly Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. There are several years of relative calm. And then the Taliban start to push back. Even before I got there, there were very underreported battles between the Canadians, big battles, terrible battles, down by Jere Pandra outside. So the mission was turning. One of the problems is because we had gone in originally for the counter-terror mission and then evolved into a nation-building piece, always with a counter-terror flavor. We just didn't have enough people to do a mission like this. And at the same point, we're working hard to build capacity in the Afghan National Army and National Police. You need people out there, and you get out into the remote area, pushing back against villages and mountain fastlands and the Taliban are little boys. And also, as we're seeing within a few years of the mission, that the Afghan government is beginning to pick up some very, very uncomfortable traits. There's corruption, there's black money. The opium thing is gigantic. We called it $10 a day Taliban because the society, there was a youth movement on and no way to employ a lot of the, especially Pashtuns out there. Then you have the intertribal issues, too detailed. So I don't want to get on too long here, but in the middle of all this, we're under-resourced. We're in the beginning trying to hold terrain. It's hard to do an insurgency. You go into a place, you do whatever you're doing, you throw them out. If you stay, then the locals can feel protected. But if you go in and do something, burn down poppies and leave, that becomes an eradication campaign, and you just build more Taliban. And so it's too big a mission. We devolved into it. Again, and as the ambassador meant, if you're 1 year rotations, 20 rotations, and many were even more half year. And the Taliban own the ground, same land, same curve around the road, same ridge, same culvert, same ambush points. And this went on with this, and it went on with us. As the ambassador said, we had basically, 20 new rotations. Yes, there were some seasoned Afghan hands, but most were coming in, they did their year and they left. And all of this makes for long-term counterinsurgency with an uncertain future. A increasingly shaky central government has huge legitimacy issues out in the countryside, and where we're trying. And then we were also grappling what we called civilian casualties, because we were doing all we could to preempt, get out there and hit cells and all that. I will say there was rigorous work to avoid civilian casualties, but when you're firing long-range drones and things like that, sadly, it's inevitable. So there was a pall on the mission that way. I was there when General McKiernan went in, worked hard. He was replaced by General McChrystal, who, as you know, had to resign a number of months later, followed by General Petraeus, who had come with a great reputation in Iraq. So the mission in many ways was snake bit at a certain point. Finally, God bless the PRTs, and I went to a number of them. They were part of that effort with the NGOs and NATO to get out there and put a little bit of a footprint for the locals to coalesce on. Just not enough in this, again, alien landlocked nation who has bigger nations around, like Pakistan, that have their own vested interests in there. And we were schizophrenic with Pakistan. We had cooperation with them on some things, and then we had the Akani network coming through from Quetta and elsewhere and killing ISAF folks in there. Complex. It's a long game. We weren't psychologically ready for the long game. I think we always, we had this sense we're going to deal with this, we'll get it quick, and we'll be out. And we got mired. A lot of good intentions, which led us to where we are today.
Thank you. You brought, yes, okay, I'm unmuted. You brought up two points actually that I was trying to decide which direction to take the conversation in next, because I know that we're getting a lot of questions in the Q&A box. You brought up Pakistan, but I think I'm going to just stick with the Taliban for one moment and turn to you, Ahmed. And you touched a little bit on this earlier, but right now the Taliban is, they're in charge. They're now faced with governing a country that has a huge humanitarian crisis. There's cash crunch. There are a lot of issues right now. And at the same time, the international community is facing this question of how do we recognize or not what is happening in Afghanistan. So what do you see happening going forward? How does the Taliban govern in this situation where they're renew to power, and they have a lot of huge problems on their hands, and also, you know, both this a hesitancy to turn to the international community for help, and at the same time an international community that's reluctant to recognize them. So how do they maneuver?
It's going to be very difficult, without a doubt. I mean, you pinpointed, I think, a very important facet of this whole relationship. The Taliban know that they will have to improve their performance on human rights if they want access to the West. On the other hand, what is even more important to them is to get off the terrorist list. At the moment, the Taliban leadership, or most of it, is on a terrorism list, which is held by the United Nations and separately by the Americans. And you're not going to get loans and money and aid until you get off that list, because you know the world doesn't give money and grants to groups who are called terrorists. So the first thing is that they have to do that, and to do that, they have to get rid of the terrorists already in Afghanistan who are not Taliban. These include Pakistani groups, Central Asian groups, Chinese groups, and of course Al-Qaeda and the Al-Qaeda leadership, which is still there. And so in other words, the Taliban have to act against their own allies, because all these militant groups had been helping the Taliban in the last few years. And in fact, they had all joined this offensive on Kabul, which eventually saw Kabul fall. So, but the West has made it absolutely clear that they want these terrorist groups to be knocked out. Now, how that will happen, whether it'll happen, whether these groups will just go underground and stay quiet, and then the West is really trapped, because there'll be starvation at one end of the picture, starvation by the Afghan people, because there's a drought, there's a shortage of food and water, electricity, everything. And on the other side, there will be this demand to get rid of these terrorist groups who have been sheltered by the Taliban, just as the Taliban in turn have been sheltered by Pakistan. So it's a very volatile, complicated situation. But clearly, the West is going to have to recognize at some point that the Taliban, this terrorism, has to go, because people are going to be hungry. And you know, the TV pictures are going to turn from what they are today, which is lots of tanks and trucks and American equipment being driven around Kabul, to people starving, literally, because the economic situation is so dire. $9 billion worth of funds are stacked up, Afghan funds are stacked up with the Americans. And the Americans are not going to release that money until they see some actual progress on the ground by the Taliban.
Thank you very much. At this point, because we have a lot of questions coming in from the Q&A box, I'm going to turn to the Q&A box. I'm going to start with a question from Dale Benedict, and I'm actually going to give this to each of our panelists in turn, because he's asking the question about the wider region. Who will fill the vacuum the US left behind, if anyone, if not the Taliban? And then if I may extrapolate on my own question, you know, what are the interests in some of these regional powers? And Brian, I think we have a map. If you wouldn't mind putting that up now, what I'll do, we can put up that map, and then I'd like to ask each of you, because I know you have different areas of expertise. And I'd like to start, Ahmed, with you and in Pakistan in particular, because I think that that's one of the biggest countries that we would need to talk about. So if you would like to talk about Pakistan and maybe some of what you're seeing in the wider region, that would be helpful. And then Peter and Ambassador Finn, I'll turn to you as well.
Well, Pakistan gave refuge to the Taliban. You know, many of the Taliban were Pakistani tribesmen rather than Afghan tribesmen. And so there's a long history of Pakistan supporting the Taliban. And even though after 9/11, the military government of General Musharraf actually sided with the US and facilitated the American presence in Afghanistan. In 2003, as Ambassador Finn has said, once the Iraq war started, the Pakistanis thought, well, the Americans are going to get out of here. We better look after our interests. And that interest was to have a government in Afghanistan that was not hostile to Pakistan. So the Pakistani military gave refuge to the Taliban and helped them grow and develop and funding arms, etc. So that Afghanistan would not be controlled by other warlord factions who were perhaps more loyal to India or to Russia. So that has really been the struggle in this region. Pakistan wanting to establish its hegemony, if you like, over these regional countries and making sure that the Taliban went along with them. So the real issue is who's going to come out on top. I firmly believe that China is going to come out on top. China has a small border with Afghanistan. It has enormous interest in the minerals and oil and gas which is available in Afghanistan and has not really been exploited except a little bit by the Russians. And China is the only country in the region which is strong enough, powerful enough economically to actually take advantage of this and exploit this mineral wealth of Afghanistan. And the Afghans, of course, are looking to China to say, well, please come in and develop our country and let us work together to do that.
Thank you. And Ambassador Finn, we had talked a little bit earlier about the role of Turkey. Would you want to comment on how they're approaching the situation in Afghanistan, or any of the other regional countries, if you would
Sure,
like?
I will talk about Turkey, but at first, just a little sidebar. Looking at the map, we should remember that the lines on the map don't exist on the ground. So there are about 10% of the population of Afghanistan are Turkmen and Uzbeks. The border between Pakistan and Afghanistan has never been officially recognized by Afghanistan, and many people in Afghanistan, including Hamid Karzai, said, when we go there, we're not going to a foreign country. When they come here, they're going to come into a foreign country. Peshawar in Pakistan was the summer capital of the Afghan rulers until the 19th century. So, and Herat was a major part of Iran. It's considered an Iranian cultural center. So, you know, these things meld, and that's something to bear in mind. With regard to Turkey, the Turks are sort of the stealth nation. They run all across Central Asia. There are Turks everywhere. All of these stands are Turkish-speaking countries, and the Turkic languages are fairly close to one another. Bearing that in mind, the Turks and the Afghans look well upon one another and always have. One of the first statements of the Taliban government was that they regarded Turkey as a friendly nation. President Erdogan said that he could have a dialogue with the Taliban, which was very controversial in Turkey. As you know, they've been talking, and there's still some conversation about the Kabul airport. The Turks were looking in cooperation with their friends, the Qataris, to run that. The Afghans said, no, we won't have any foreign troops. Erdogan has now said, well, you know, if they're going to run security, then there's a bloodbath and we're there. How is that going to look? That's not good. But we're still open to talking to them. So there's room there for a dialogue. And I think that's good because somebody has to talk to the Taliban. Someone has to talk to them with whom they're willing to talk, with whom they have a certain amount of trust. So I think that's an advantage for us, and also in global terms will be an advantage for Turkey because President Erdogan could use some points with the West.
Thank you. And we're also getting a couple of questions about Russia. So Peter, turning to you, I know I think the Russians met with the Taliban pre-US exit. What is your take, having spent so much time in Russia? What are their interests in the region, and what are they looking for from this situation?
First of all, I ask everybody to just, again, look at the map again, because, you know, while the players may change, not completely, as we're seeing, geography never does. And Taliban sits right there, landlocked between, for those regions, whatever you would call great and regional powers, Remember, the Russian border used to be Central Asia. So Russia right up until 1991 bordered Afghanistan. And it was through Uzbekistan they retreated out in 1989. But Russia was also, I mean, what it makes this extraordinary is constantly concerned about the actions and activities to its south, its own expansion and imperialism. The British were there. Can you believe it? We were there. Look at it in the map. So you have the Russians today. They actually, it was unpredictable and maybe cynical in ways, but they supported the northern supply route in the early days of the ISAF mission. We were able to fly from Frankfurt and all that over Central Asia into Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. And the Russians were, whatever reason, they're okay with it. But over time, as the situation has developed, they wanted us out, even though I believe there's a side of them that like us in because it sapped us over the last 20 years. Russia today, Russia, in talking to, Russia always believed that the mission will fail. The fail meaning a credible, centrally governed government and society. And they basically, I believe, in their what you could call dalliance or relations we read about in recent years with the Taliban. One, there is great power competition. Anywhere the United States are putting major equity and it bumps up against the Russians, they're going to interfere and compete and make it difficult. And that's sort of, and that's one aspect of it. But two, they believed the fall of Afghanistan was inevitable, and they wanted to be sure that they had links in with the guys that they thought were going to win. And that has played out. And third, and this is probably what's happened in the last couple of weeks out at the airfield, has maybe slightly edited their thinking, but they're also preparing for a collapsed Afghanistan, which is still possible, and the furies of jihadism, migration, drugs, crime, flooding into what you would call their interests in Central Asia. By the way, they have interests, but we don't support the concept that is a sphere of influence, but certainly interest. And they do believe that, especially jihad and peace, and that it takes root in there, destabilizes these countries, and then even worse, can create problems in southern Russia, in the Caucasus, where there are large Sunni population. So there's a lot going on. Finally, there's sort of the new age great game of jockeying and balancing going on, and Russia will certainly be playing in that. You've got Russia, who has decent relations with India, who has an interest in Afghanistan because Pakistan has a big interest in their enemies. You have Iran, who has always had a long legacy in history, and both, by the way, the richest part of Afghanistan in my time was actually in the west near Mazar, even as Iranian IEDs came over the border to support blowing us up there. So the Iran is big and complex there. We've talked about schizophrenic Pakistan, who are friends of China. And I'll leave with China. You've got their Belt and Road Initiative. China seems to be resource driven, and Afghanistan is right on that Belt and Road highway in Central Asia. They need a secure Afghanistan, so both ideally they can conduct minerals and resource and all that, and be able to flow, if you will, their economy and resource toward the Caspian and elsewhere. So Russia is a big player in all of that. And I close, remember that the Russian border until 1991 were those Central Asian countries, and it always had an interest in Afghanistan and the region.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Peter. I'm going something a little unusual now. So we've talked a lot about the Taliban. We have a friend of Network 2020 who is on the call. She is from Afghanistan. I'd like to just ask her to say a few words. So Avesta Nasir, are you here? If you are, I'd love for you to unmute and just give a little bit of perspective from the ground, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, thank you, Courtney, for giving me the time. Thank you, everybody, for being in the event. And with all due respect to all the panelists here, I'm having a quite different view, and I see myself as a representative of the new generation of Afghanistan. I live in Toronto, and with what's happening in Afghanistan, I have been so much under pressure. My family is there, so I have started to having some cough issue, and that happens at any time I go through emotional pressure. So if I cough, please forgive me. I'll try not to. So I'm gonna be very, very brief as I can, to kind of say our perspective of why it happened this way and what's gonna be next. So I'll try to be as brief as possible. I agree with one thing Joe Biden has said so far. Afghanistan is not a nation and never has been. Apart from being a racist and disgraceful and aiming it to belittle and disrespect the people of Afghanistan, this can be also argued as a reality. But I do not agree with the second part of his sentence, which says the war in Afghanistan was never about nation building. This part is quite delusional. First of all, becoming a nation or nation building is not a phenomenon. We all know that, but it's a continuous process. In this country I live, in Canada, nation building project is not complete. The province of Quebec and the native peoples, for example, do not see themselves as part of the Canadian nation. And none of the Afghanistan neighboring countries are nations. And most of the Middle East and the Islamic world, the nation building project started in early to mid 20th century, like Turkey, Afghanistan, and Iran, Afghanistan under Amanullah Khan. These three countries developed and started implementing their nation building projects by what's known as majority rule over minority, by elimination, forced migration, and suppression of minority groups. In Afghanistan, Amanullah failed to do what Ataturk did in Turkey. And there are so many reasons behind his failure, the most important of which, in our view, is that there was not and is not a majority group in Afghanistan. All ethnic groups are minority. So all through the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, the Soviet version of nation building project was also based on Pashtun ethnocentrism, the way that Amanullah was trying to do. Fast forward to the US invasion in 2001 and the Bonn Conference, the US also relied upon those people whom it thought could complete that nation building project. Again, the Pashtun ethnocentrists. And I can give examples, but I don't think we have time for it. I'm gonna pass it. In 2014, the US suspiciously made Ghani the president after an outrageously fraudulent election. John Kerry appointed him as president by forming what's called a national unity government, through which the Afghan constitution was sent to the garbage. The so-called election in 2019 was an absolute embarrassment, not just to Afghanistan, but to all those nations who call themselves democratic. Yet the US recognized it and accepted Ghani as the president. Ghani showed his real face as the most notorious Pashtun ethnocentrist throughout his 7 years of administration. He was a kleptocrat, not a technocrat or a state builder, as he claimed. He built his version of kleptocracy with one political goal, the continuation of Pashtun political and military hegemony in Afghanistan, which resulted in the total meltdown and fragmentation of the state. He centralized the power as much as he personally appointed low-ranked police district chiefs, paving the way for the handover of the country to the Taliban. Everybody asks why military didn't fight. Military didn't fight because he didn't allow them to. He made sure that every single provincial governor or head of the military is someone from his own circle, those who prevented the foot soldiers from fighting. So I dare to say that the collapse of the Afghan state today is the result of a Pashtun ethnocentrist nation building project that the Americans tried to implement. By now, it should be clear to all that the Taliban is an ethno-Islamic fascist group. Its ideology constitutes a mixture of Deobandi Islam and Afghan ethno-nationalism. This character is crystal clear from the Taliban's constituency, their rank and file, their middle rank who occupy the administrative positions, their leadership in Kandahar, Kabul, and Doha, and their sympathizers and advocates. But the anti-Taliban constituency, what is known as the resistance too, led by Ahmad Massoud in Panjshir Valley, fights for and represents the opposite character. I personally see him as the representative of my generation. This resistance should evolve and must be supported by the US and the international community and whoever believes in human rights and human dignity. Any form of solution which seeks power sharing or even an ideal accommodation with Taliban through decentralization is not just a moral, but also a political defeat to the ideals of resistance and nation building, because it legitimizes the Taliban and its ideology. I do not agree with Mr. Rashid, who just said that, wait to see whether the Taliban let non-Taliban Afghans to take part in the government. It's ironic. We should wait for a terrorist group to let us govern alongside with them. Even NATO's requesting Taliban to commit to their agreement and not let other terrorist groups in Afghanistan, as well as Germany's hand on opening German embassy in Kabul, are absolutely ridiculous because it further legitimizes the Taliban. So yes, we are defeated, but instead of hoping for making peace with a terrorist group, the people of Afghanistan have already started boycotting them by seeking exile. Let me tell you, Pashtuns do not represent majority, never have done, and not all Pashtuns are Talibs or ethnocentrists. We want our land, our country back, either through full-fledged federal confederation like Switzerland, or separation between those of us who believe in human rights and dignity and women's rights, and we make 70+% of the Afghan population, including ordinary Pashtuns, and those who do not believe in any of these things, and they are the Taliban and the Pashtun ethnocentrists. So right now, the fact that the US portrays ISIS-K as the biggest threat also legitimizes, also giving legitimacy and new normalcy to the Taliban. We shouldn't forget that ISIS is not sent over by al-Baghdadi or Zarqawi. ISIS-K is just another branch of the Taliban with a black color flag, most of whom are non-Pashtuns, political dissidents coming from Central Asian states. Taliban even brought former aide of bin Laden yesterday to Kabul, Amil Haq, and there's a rumor that he will have an important role in the Taliban's administration. My final remark, let's not advocate, when I'm saying not, I say it with all capital letters. Let's not advocate for a new normal in peace, neither with the Islamofascist Taliban, nor with the Pashtun ethnocentrists like Karzai, Ghani, Ahadi, and many more. Thank you.
Thank you, Avesta. I know this has been a very difficult time for you. I appreciate your remarks, and thank you, panelists and audience, for that, for listening. Obviously, I think that there's a lot that we can dig into in future webinars. If there's anything that the panelists would want to react to in that, please do. Otherwise, I'll get a few more questions in before we close. If not, then I'm going to turn to a question from Joanna Voschowski, and this is for you, Ahmed. In the book, The Great Game, Peter Hopkirk describes the difficulty for the 19th century Great Britain of maintaining alliances with Afghan tribal leaders who switched allegiances frequently. Will the Taliban have such a challenge?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there is going to be a resistance to the Taliban. It will come from non-Pashtuns and Pashtuns, and I'm pretty certain about that. And we've seen some demonstrations of reaction against the Taliban already in some of the major cities. So it's not going to be smooth sailing at all. I think there's going to be a lot of unrest, and maybe not an insurgency as such, but certainly a lot of unrest. And the Taliban are going to handle that probably in a very aggressive way, because that's the way they have always viewed any kind of opposition. And of course, that's going to exacerbate the tensions and make things possibly even worse. The other thing is the food crisis, the humanitarian crisis. Afghanistan desperately needs food, and it desperately needs a fair way of dishing out that food, distributing it. If the Taliban are going to take control, we are going to be in the same mess as we were before. Because what we need are the NGOs, the United Nations, and some of these bodies to be given the responsibility by the Taliban and by the international community for distribution of aid. If that doesn't happen, then this aid is going to be wasted as much as earlier aid was wasted in Afghanistan.
Well, speaking of aid, I have a question from Arlette Laurent, and I'll direct this to you, Ambassador Finn. And she asks, could the balance of U.S. expenditures have been more constructive if there were greater emphasis on the civilian or diplomatic side rather than on the military Pentagon side? And Peter, you might also want to chime in on this. Could a Marshall Plan approach have given the Afghan people a better role in their own country?
Thank you. I appreciate that. I absolutely agree with it. The vast majority of the money that was spent in Afghanistan was spent on the military, and even in the funds which are described as being allotted for reconstruction and building the government, a major, I don't know if it's the major, but certainly a major chunk of that went to the police instead of building other kinds of infrastructure. So yes, I would say absolutely that should have been done and that could have been done.
I'd like to add a perspective. In the immediate couple of years after the Taliban was pushed out, there was a lot of, if you will, reconstruction and aid money that came pouring in from all over, whether U.S. coalition and NGOs. And the military at that time, their mission was to provide safe and secure so that folks out in the hinterland, but also in the cities, could work with that. But I think over time, the deleterious effects of so much money all around, washing around in the country, started to create the issues that we've talked about, creating safe and secure issues, which created the need to keep plussing up the military. And then we go off on our preemptive strikes and counter strikes. And the Taliban, meanwhile, is gaining strength from an increasingly anxious, angry, if you will, rural population, and we know the result. The military just didn't come in incredibly, hugely endowed. This was always a team effort. But as the insurgency got heavier, indeed, the military got more beefed up, which increased in many ways the insurgency.
Peter, if I can just add to what you said, the real issue was that for 2 years after 9/11, 2.5 years, there was complete peace in Afghanistan. There was no insurrection. There was no Taliban. They were all crushed. And at that critical moment when U.S. military and aid and NGOs, etc., were needed, they were all zapped off to Iraq to fight the war in Iraq. And that was the crux of the whole issue. And once the American troops left to fight in Iraq, the Taliban began a revival, and they were helped by friendly allies, Iran, Pakistan, and others. But they revived, and then they started their insurgency. So, in the 2 years that you're talking about, there was incredible progress. From the bottom up, schools and hospitals and clinics and women were coming out, and etc. etc. It was a very, very inspiring time at that point to be in Afghanistan and to see all this happening.
Thank you. Thanks for all those perspectives. I'll try to get in one more quick question and then do maybe a little bit of a lightning round if we have time. We have a question from Kyle Marston, who asks, how do the panelists evaluate the Qatari role as a potential mediator between the Taliban and the international community? Ahmed, do you just want to comment on that quickly, the role of Qatar?
Well, I think Qatar has been immensely helpful Qatar had its own political reasons for doing this. It didn't want the mediation to go to Saudi Arabia, with which it was at odds, and nor did many of the Taliban want the Saudis involved. And Qatar's role has been, extremely productive, I think. And the generosity of the Qataris to host hundreds and hundreds of people for months on end. And they've exposed the Taliban also to a different lifestyle of how people live and how people, and that I think has been, I hope that has been useful for the Taliban to see that, you know, there's another way of living apart from just fighting for extreme views.
Thank you for that. Before we wrap, we have just a couple of minutes left. I'd like to just turn to each panelist in turn and just see what is it that you are going forward? What is it that you're looking to see right now? What are some sort of major milestones that you might see in terms of the future development of Afghanistan, in terms of the Taliban's ability to govern? What is it that you're paying attention to and looking for right now? Ambassador Finn, could I start with you?
Yeah, well, I like all of us, I'm hopeful that they will have a more inclusive and a slightly moderate government. You know, everyone in Afghanistan has learned a lot in the last 20 years, and that includes the Taliban. We can see that in the sophistication of their attack and of their cohesive message they gave, they're not the same people they were. I'm hoping, we always hope, we're diplomats, that this will transfer into a more moderate state. As I said earlier, they're not the only extremists in Afghanistan. There are lots of religious extremists in Afghanistan and a lot of other places as well. So to put them in that box and say, oh, nothing is good is going to come of that is very short-sighted. You have to work on them, work with them, see what you can do. As Ahmed pointed out before, they need the assistance that can be given to them by the international community. They don't want riots in the streets. So we just have to see what will happen. And we don't know yet because we're getting very mixed signals. It's one thing to take over a country, it's another thing to run a country. And I'm not sure that the people that we're seeing with guns in the streets of Kabul are going to be able to run that country. So then we have to see what they do. Where do they turn for help? Is Pakistan going to turn around and play a good role with its highly trained professionals? Are the countries of Central Asia who speak the languages of Afghanistan going to provide their people? That was one thing I was trying to have happen, is to have medical professionals and others come from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, all of which, because they are part of the Soviet Union, are very highly developed in all of these areas, and have them help. So there are things that can be done, and we have to just hope that they're wise enough and mature enough to do them.
Thank you. Peter, your quick thoughts. What are you looking at?
First of all, with the seizure, takeover of the airport and the country, the chapter of our physical deployment, if you will, in Afghanistan is over, but this is just the beginning of a new chapter. The United States is much diminished materially in the region. It still has its influence and its diplomacy, its economy, and those are going to matter, especially to, I believe, the Taliban, who live everywhere between the dark ages and maybe a more enlightened leadership based on Doha and the things that we're talking about. They're going to be in a balancing game. Do we, the question is, how deeply do we want to be involved in it? But you see, in part, I believe the Afghan diaspora, a lot of really smart, competent people with aspirations are going to push to do it. And we do have interest in the area. And if there's any positive legacy in all this, is that we left millions of Afghans, especially young Afghans and women and girls with aspirations inside. And that's not going to go away. And the Taliban is going to have to manage that. And I want to believe that we have also left a legacy of goodwill, we, the international community and all of that. And this is just going to take time to play out. Finally, they're in a world of wolves around them in various degrees, maybe in sheep clothing. So the Taliban has an enormous amount to balance if they survive in the present state at all.
And Ahmed, final thoughts. What are you looking at?
Well, you know, what worries me is that I think the whole American interest in this region is going to disappear, because President Biden has made it clear that his focus is going to be China and East Asia. Now, if that happens, that means not just the Americans, but the Europeans and a lot of the international attention that should come to Afghanistan to help it survive the famine and the drought, and will not be there, quite frankly. And remember, the Afghans have been through this before, because after 1989 and the Soviet withdrawal, the Americans abandoned Afghanistan for the next 5 or 6 years. And that is what precisely encouraged the civil war and allowed the Taliban to emerge for the first time in the 90s. And many Afghans are saying that that's what's going to happen this time for the second time. The Americans are going to walk away, and they're not going to care about what happens in this part of the world anymore. And they'll leave it to all, as Peter said, the wolves who neighbor Afghanistan, and all the wolves want a chunk of Afghanistan for themselves, and the poor Afghans are going to be left in the lurch once again.
On that note, we're past time. Thank you all for your time. Thank you, audience. Really tremendous questions, some really good ones in the Q&A box. I'm sorry I could not get to all of them. We hope to have more discussions along these lines. I think that there's a lot to talk about. If anyone wants to and is not yet on our mailing list, please do sign up for our mailing list. We'll be renewing briefings now that the summer's over, and as well as some other programs. So please do join our mailing list and continue to come to these webinars. Ahmed, Peter, Ambassador Finn, thank you all so much. I can speak for everyone when I say I think we really enjoyed this. And Avesta, if you're still on the line, thank you very much for your thoughts too. I truly appreciate it. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.